Hi, today I'm going to offer you some insights into big data and AI, the potential of what can go right and what can happen when things go wrong. Let's start with a fact that won't surprise you, but which is worth putting into perspective. A large portion of our global population spends a substantial amount of time online in systems designed to control their behavior. I'm not talking about an evil AI that's taken over the world. I'm talking about Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Snapchat, and other sites that feed on human attention. And they are successful. Altogether, over 2.7 billion people use Facebook and another 2 billion use YouTube. And it's designed to keep you there. Once people start a session watching YouTube on their mobile phone, they end up staying on that session for over an hour on average. The feed is addictive. It's common for people to check social media over 100 times a day. So just to put this into perspective now, we have more than the amount of followers of the two largest religions on earth, neither of which requires praying 100 times a day. Now that is true devotion. How did the titans of the attention economy become so successful? These companies didn't win because of brilliant design or clever psychology or con artistry. These systems can manipulate human behavior at these scales because of AI operating on big data. Now, every day these sites run psychology experiments on their subjects that are orders of magnitude larger than anything ever published in a scientific journal. They gather every scrap of information about how people interact with these systems, aggregated over billions of people every day. They feed this data into the most powerful AI technology deployed at an unprecedented scale. And what do they do with this? They learn from all of us how to get us all to play along. Now, this is no secret or conspiracy theory. Of the billion hours watched on YouTube each day, over 2/3, 70%, are due to the AI-driven recommendation algorithm. This is an intended consequence of AI, a point of pride by the company, that the AI is driving usage. But now let's look at what kind of content is offered by these AI-driven recommendation engines. Let's say you do a Google search for the question, the factual question, is the Earth flat? Okay, now, if you do this to Google, 20% of the pages on the internet claim it's flat. This is too bad. I don't know if it's bots or whatever, it doesn't matter, because since you asked the question to Google, your critical mind is still engaged and you're actually able to make sense of the answers. However, if you check the content on this question that is recommended by the YouTube recommendation engine, which gives you stuff you didn't ask for, remember? 90% of the videos on the question of the Earth being flat or not say it's flat. So if you're curious about more examples like that, check out this site, algotransparency.org. And did you know that dumb AI likes to recommend false news? Now, why would that be? In an MIT study of Twitter that was published in Science, researchers found that news spreads much faster and farther if it's false than if it's true. Like on Twitter, if you watch information that's traveling, if it's false, it goes faster and farther. Now, the AI models don't know the difference between true and false. They only know that people seem to be liking certain kinds of stuff, and the model watches and factors that in to recommendations. So basically what it's doing is amplifying our human weakness for gossip. Now, in 2017, the head of Facebook set the corporate objective to get people to join Facebook groups to, quote, bring the world closer together. Now, that's a good idea. He told his team to go do it with AI. And it worked, maybe a little too well. The recommendation engine did its thing. When someone joined a new Facebook group, the engine recommended other groups to join. But the engine didn't always recommend new groups of human beings that you really want to meet. For example, if you were joining a Facebook group for new mothers, guess what the engine recommended? Anti-vaccine conspiracy groups. And once you're in one of those groups, imagine what kind of other groups are being recommended. Now, why blame AI? The internet's full of misinformation and conspiracy theories. We all know this. But most people aren't aware that AI is contributing to the problem by recommending this stuff to users. And real harm is done. This is not free speech or the wisdom of crowds. This is deadly misinformation at scale. In 2019, the World Health Organization declared that anti-vaccine misinformation, much of it driven by recommendation engines, is now a top 10 global health threat, up there with malaria. Cases of measles have surged 30%. This is an effective vaccine. This is crazy. And this year, we have watched in horror as misinformation spread through algorithmically governed social media is leading thousands of people to die unnecessarily during today's global pandemic. The harms done by algorithm-driven social media are described powerfully by the documentary called The Social Dilemma, which is now available on Netflix and doing quite well. It's about the work of the Center for Humane Technology. As a human being, I highly recommend the documentary. Now, the center is advised by tech industry insiders like me, and they also try to help change the industry from within. So, for example, after the publicity about anti-vaccine groups, Facebook patched the bug. And it's also done a lot of things to help with mental health issues. But this is a system problem, not an isolated incident. It's a consequence of building systems that optimize an objective without aligning the objective with human impact. The problem is hard to solve because the systems are not governed by humans. They're governed by machines running AI software operating at scales way beyond what humans can do. So, what's happened is a Frankenstein story, a story of out-of-control technology and unintended consequences. All that data fed into all those AI models has produced a kind of superintelligence, an intelligence about controlling human attention. It has won the contest for human attention. We don't have a chance. And in an adversarial game exploited by propagandists and political animals, AI that recommends false and potentially dangerous content is a threat to the epistemological contract on which our society is built. Okay, is your head ready to explode? Don't worry, it won't, because this is not superintelligence like you hear about in Terminator or Skynet. It's not artificial general intelligence. That's AI that can fool all of us all the time. No, this is not general intelligence. The AI behind these recommendation systems is today's narrow AI, but it's applied to insane amounts of data about how people behave online. This AI has no idea what is true or false, helpful or harmful, or just plain crazy. It's brilliant, but it's an empty-headed idiot savant. All this narrow AI knows is what the data tells it will work to get people to do things to maximize the business objective. This is an AI expert at manipulating human attention only and nothing else. So to really understand what's going on, we need to get a little more technical and understand a key factor in the way AI works. It's called the objective function. Now, at the core of any AI system is the model, which takes an input like an image, performs a computation, and then determines what class it's in, classifies the image. Now, the objective function sets on the side and evaluates how well the model is doing its job. The objective function must be a metric that the computer can compute by looking at data from observation or simulation. Now, the objective function itself is core to the machine learning process. You know, these AI algorithms you hear about, they don't do anything unless they're trained, and they're trained with an objective function. So, for example, that AI system to classify photos, when it's presented with a photo of a cat, and it gets the answer right, the objective function goes, yep, good idea. If it gets it wrong, it says no. And they repeat this over millions of examples of cats and other things. And the machine learning algorithm makes a model that's good at classifying photos. Now, in AI systems that play games, like chess or Go, the role of the AI model is to evaluate how likely a particular move will lead to victory, so the program can choose the best move at each turn. The objective function evaluates models at how well they predict the value of moves. The only factor considered in the objective function is whether the move is on a winning path. And this is typically computed by having the AI game play itself billions of times, and then after doing this more than any time that any humans could possibly ever experience, it now has a good sense of which moves are winning moves, and it can beat the pants off any humans. Now, what about the attention economy? On a social media platform, The AI system is effectively playing a competitive game against its human users all the time to get the behavior it's designed to maximize. Now, the goal of the AI model is to determine, for each piece of content to put in front of the user, which one will lead to more engagement, kind of like choosing moves. The machine learning that drives the recommendation engine is governed by an objective function that is based on 3 metrics. Maximize human time on site, maximize humans clicking on things that might be ads, and maximize humans doing things that get other humans involved, recruiting other people into the game. Now, with billions of people interacting with social media sites every day, the AI system has enough data to win the game with overwhelming force. The problem is the human is on the wrong side of the equation. Nowhere in the objective functions of social media are the hard to quantify soft metrics on the impact of this behavior on critical thinking, mental health, and public discourse. As a result, we get unintended consequences of automation. Now, the AI engineers working on these systems don't program them to recommend dangerous information. Of course not. These engineers are just doing their job, which is to make models that achieve the quantitative objectives established by their employers. Now, what can we do about it? Can we fix the objective function? Yes, but it's not easy. Remember, the objective function must be a metric that is computable, measurable, computable by the computer. You can't just tell the AI to say, do the right thing for humanity. You can't say, for instance, like Asimov's laws of robotics, the first law was do no harm to humans. Well, today's idiot savant AI doesn't know what that sentence means and can't know what that sentence means. Now, this is a problem worth solving. It's not going to be easy because human impact is much harder to measure than page views and clicks. And how do you teach the machine that the content it's recommending will cause harm to humans or have them cause it to others? It's not easy, but it's worth solving. And as long as the objective functions are blind to the content, as long as they don't have anything in them about what's in that stuff they're recommending, then the problems will remain. Pretty scary, huh? Well, I think there's an alternative. What if we put AI on the human team? This is what I call humanistic AI, which is designed to empower humans rather than compete with them. The key is to think about how to build human benefits into the objective function from the beginning. Now, my strategy has been to look for applications that augment or collaborate with humans and to define the objective functions for those applications as the joint performance of the pair of human and machine. And that performance is on a task that humans are struggling to achieve. So let's take an example. Let's look at modern video games. Today, what's their objective function? Maximize game time, just like social media. They present game stimulus to the user, like Facebook puts things in your feed, and they're optimized to present just the right amount and level of stimuli that the model predicts will produce the right amount of dopamine rush in you that reinforces the addictive behavior. But you know what doesn't make sense to me? I'm not a gamer, but the people I know who play games, they do it to kill time, not to kill people. I mean, with the power of fully immersive interfaces being developed right now, game designers no longer need or should have to rely on that dopamine charge from violence to be successful. We can use game dynamics, which are powerful psychological motivators, to help players have empathy for people and maybe consider situations that are outside the filter bubbles created by today's online world. What if we change the game so that AI is on our side? We can build an objective function to measure positive human behavior. A company that creates games can create AI models that predict not only whether a given technique increases gameplay, but that it encourages behaviors that improve the user's well-being and positive social interactions. And that's exactly what a company called TrueLove.ai is doing. Instead of optimizing for dopamine-fueled addiction, their game-like experience offers a nurturing relationship with an AI character that optimizes for caring and compassion. You think this is crazy, but over 2 million people have already downloaded the early experiment, which is called self-care, and it's showing a new way for interface experiences to influence human behavior in a positive direction. Now, in addition to helping us learn new behaviors, AI can help us understand what's going on in our own minds and bodies, and this has huge potential. Take, for example, the problem of serious mental illness. Now, millions suffer from the conditions such as bipolar disorder, psychosis, and so on. And mental health care professionals are not very good at predicting when someone will suffer from one of these conditions, even though early intervention makes a big difference to save lives and restore function. What if we could deploy AI models that could predict from data that you already have when someone would need to go in for care? Well, a company called MindStrong has developed AI models that can do just that. These models are based on what's called digital brain biomarkers that measure human cognition and mood. It turns out that the human-computer interactions required to use a smartphone today puts a cognitive load on the person. It's a sensitive window into low-level cognitive circuit functions. Now, the system gathers data on how you tap and scroll and use the keyboard, and a big neural net uses that data to detect disruptions in these cognitive circuits. And from changes in this behavior, the model can predict clinically relevant disruptions to cognitive control and working memory. For example, in one real-world case, a patient under care for bipolar disorder and psychosis seemed to be doing okay, but her brain biomarkers indicated that something was wrong. She had a little bit of sleep issues, but she didn't know anything was really going wrong. But the biomarkers detected something. Her healthcare team was alerted and discussed the situation with her. She checked herself into the hospital for care and treatment, and to her great relief, she was able to restore her mental health. The AI models predicted a breakdown, which did happen during her stay in the hospital, where she could get the treatment, prevent a crisis, and restore health. Now, this is a great example of a collaboration between humans and AI, each doing what they do best. Now, this is objective function for mental health care is going after a new skill. It's a superhuman talent at predicting internal mental conditions inside the brain of a human by watching their daily activity on the phone. Another case of predictive AI is addressing an issue that affects every human on the planet right now, knowing whether you are infected with COVID. The company is called Migraine.ai because they make an app for migraine that predicts, based on the data in your phone, kind of like MindStrong, whether you're going to have a migraine headache. For example, it likes to use selfie video, so you can take a selfie video, and it can tell a bunch of vital signs and information from that. And that, together with the things it asks you, can predict migraines better than humans. And that turns out to be key for effective treatment. Now, when the pandemic hit, Migraine.ai was able to apply their technology for gathering vital signs and digital biomarkers to create a COVID screening app. Now, they can detect vitals like heart rate variability, respiration, more things, and the kind of cough that is characteristic of COVID. It actually has a characteristic sound to it, all from just a selfie video that you do. Now, the goal is to be able to predict whether you have COVID or not better than you can today. And as we know, 40% of the cases are, quote, pre-symptomatic or unsymptomatic. These are only a few points of light in the galaxy of humanistic AI applications. How might we use this perspective to turn things around from a world where AI is used against humans to a world where AI is inherently aligned with humanity? I think the challenge is to change the way we define the objectives for AI technology. And we do that by redefining the objective functions we use to train and evaluate our models. Now, to conclude, let me ask yourself, if you're an investor choosing AI companies, or an entrepreneur making products, or an engineer working on an AI project, or a manager managing that project in a company, what would you want to put in your objective function? And what can you insist should be measured, even if it's hard, and what goals should be rewarded? And for all of us, as members of our society and stewards of our planet, what externalities should we demand be counted in the objective functions that drive the AI systems that create wealth and prosperity? Thanks very much for your attention.
Hi, I'm John Markoff. I began writing about Tom a number of years ago, and I've watched the evolution of his work through Siri and to the stuff he's doing today. I want to begin, you focus on what you call the objective function, but I want to start with something else you talked about, which was superintelligence. In Silicon Valley, where we are, people have been very optimistic about the arrival of what you called artificial general intelligence. You also spoke about superintelligence. I just wondered, since you left Apple, how your views have changed on how quickly, or if ever, we're going to reach those kinds of non-narrow AI capabilities.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it's accelerating. I was actually kind of a curmudgeon about it earlier um, because essentially people are cherry picking examples of clever AI and saying, "See, this is evidence that we're going general." And what's happening now is essentially there are algorithms like the transformer algorithms that are showing general purpose generalization capabilities that scale with computation. In other words, you can throw hardware and money at the problem and get an accelerated advance in the intelligence. So, so I think I'm a little bit more. I think it's good. We're going to have broader kinds of intelligence sooner than we thought. Um, I don't think that this equates to agency, which is something that people confuse it with. Like, to be really smart at predicting what movie is going to make you stay online is different than having a relationship with you that has the kind of things that humans have in a relationship. So that may require psychology, improvements in psychology,
Okay.
and that kind of science.
And, is that so? There was an early critique of AI done by a Berkeley philosopher called John Searle, who talked about this notion of a Chinese room, basically a very smart machine that had no human qualities at all, no consciousness. What about the possibility of achieving human-like consciousness as opposed to human-like abilities? It's a
Well, I
philosophical
mean,
question, I guess.
it's a philosophical question. I mean, I've always been a fan of Alan Newell's uh, thinking about this when he wrote the paper on the ant. He basically said that intelligence is projected. As far as we know, we only know of the meaning of the word intelligence, especially the way we mean like agency and intelligence of a human or an entity. It's something we attribute to them. You can't directly observe it, really. And so in his case, he was talking about rational agents. I think Searle was basically making an extreme point, which is, you can continue to sort of curve fit the input outputs on an intelligent system until there is no distinction that's relevant anymore. Okay, so the question is really, do these new experiments where they basically read the entire internet, and then make all the generalizations they can from that, are those generalizations the kind that matter for general intelligence? And that's the open question. I don't know. But there's nothing in principle that says you couldn't do the same thing for, like, people are doing experiments like our friend, our friend is doing the experiments with the robot arms, where they just like run robots forever and see what happens. And they're doing that now in simulation, which can go a lot faster. If you could simulate physical stuff as well as like written things, and explore huge search spaces, then you could also imagine finding generalizations in those spaces.
Yeah. So I also want to ask you, your point about the objective function is an interesting one as a way of solving this problem. But when you mentioned the objective function, it reminded me of Milton Friedman and his basic sort of point that corporations should just think about their shareholders. Their objective function was following the guidance or optimizing for their shareholders. So if you're thinking about the giant tech platforms, which they seem to be doing what Milton Friedman had in mind, how do you change the objective function for them?
Well, I mean, the modern corporate leaders shouldn't be thinking of a single bottom line anymore. I mean, the Business Roundtable, which is like 200 of the top CEOs in the world, agreed that stakeholders should include things other than shareholders and profit. They should include externalities like the planet and the population and society you live in, and things like welfare as important as well as wealth. And so it's not a radical idea that we should account for more than just a single profit line. And I think that's sort of the, I mean, Milton was an economist, so that was his thing. That was the currency he worked in, so to speak. But I think that we're seeing it even in like the chairman of the second largest conglomerate in Korea is a big fan of double bottom line accounting, where he basically says all the way down this $1 trillion conglomerate, I want to see accounting and reporting all the way up of both profit and impact on society and human. So essentially what I'm saying with the objective function is essentially you can take that idea of top-down value alignment that's beyond money. It's money and not money or. And you can bubble it down all the way down into the models that the AI engines are being driven by. And they can help, that way is one way of aligning the impact of those models with the goals of the company.
We have some audience questions. Here's the classic one. Couldn't AI bring about a Terminator situation? Question I'm sure you get frequently.
Well, I mean, look, yes, and CRISPR could generate the end of the world, and a bunch of other things that can happen if a bad actor gets a hold of powerful technology and does bad things with it. And society's response all along has been, and well, let's not let that happen on our watch. Let's have governments and defense and countermeasures and free speech and all these other things that are sort of balances so that this stuff doesn't happen in the dark. If someone's building a Terminator, let's find out who they are and let's put them away. You know, this is a, you can't stop it by stopping the technology.
So going back to the objective function, do you think that you can do some of the things that you would want to do to get these corporations to act in different ways without a regulatory framework? And if we use a regulatory framework, why don't we just use it with its own objective function to do things that might be good for society as a whole?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know whether that, I mean, the owners of Google and Facebook don't actually have to report to shareholders. So I'm not sure who else they would be accountable to except for the government. But I don't know whether it will require that. I mean, usually, like for instance, a lot of companies are doing green things, you know, things good for the environment, because of the threat of potential future stuff that might happen, particularly if it's economic, like carbon trading or something like that. So you can imagine kind of and also a lot of the motivation, by the way, for the double bottom line corporate governance is that corporations want to succeed beyond the quarter. They have to have a contract with the society in which they work, with their customers and everything. And so if they burn that bridge by just exploiting the commons of the actual population, they're not planning for the long term. So it's not good corporate governance to only focus on short term.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions about social media. You talked about the ability of falsehoods to move more quickly than truth in social networks. Here's a question. Do you think TikTok AI has an equal level of falsehood spreading as YouTube? Is it different in any way, or is the same level of idiot survive? So is there a difference between them? Is there a significant difference? And then there's another question that relates to this. Is there a significant difference between the platforms?
I'm not sure of how the algorithm works in TikTok, except that I know that it's a lot less personalized. And so there's a lot more about the value of the content per se, rather than how it scratches your brains down. And so I don't know for sure, but it definitely has AI in the algorithm, but I think they are very, maybe it has to do with governance. I mean, the people who run TikTok, I don't know them personally, but they appear to be focusing on certain kinds of content and creator-centric values rather than just letting advertisers do whatever they want.
Yeah. There's a question also about another social media platform called Parler, which has been embraced by conservatives. I don't know a lot about it. Have you looked at Parler and seen, are they doing anything different than other social media platforms?
Well, I haven't looked at them yet, but I mean, there's going to be a fragmentation of tribal bubbles, and it's going to happen. There are also really positive, sort of pro-human, pro-Earth social networks that are starting to spawn. What the open question is: does the Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, do those guys actually have a sort of a network effect that's so strong that you can't create new bubbles? And I don't know. I mean, that's an empirical question. I applaud people trying to change it. I mean, if the right wing barricades themselves in that Parler, maybe that's good, because because all they're going to do is activate the base, and the rest of the politic can talk about issues.
Yeah.
So
we have another interesting question. Well, actually, I'd like to hear your answer to this, because I'm curious about how complex these algorithms you're describing are. Devil's advocate question. If the internet is so powerful, why does it always advertise products to me that I've already purchased? Also, I'm an avid surfer and I search for surf related content, but I never once got an ad for surf gear. Same for skiing.
Yeah. Well, maybe you have good data protection. I don't
Yeah.
know. But, I don't know. The internet's not that powerful. Remember, you don't buy Viagra, but you get Viagra ads in spam. It used to be. It's the same thing. It's like there's an economics to advertising on the internet, and if you're an unusual character, maybe you're a surfer and an entrepreneur and an investor and blah blah blah. I mean, you're not a normal person. You don't fit the profile, the statistical profile that these machines are aiming at. I know that's really a failure of the advertising business rather than the internet or the social media platforms, that they're giving you bad recommendations. The thing that scares me the most is that, though, when the AI algorithms discover these things that work to get you going, to get you hooked, that a human wouldn't have ever even discovered. But the AI, because it's just got so much data, it just finds these weird things like, oh my God, this works to keep them hooked. It's a kind of a clickbait, you know, uh, machine, and that's happening in the dark. When that happens, an algorithm discovers something like that. No human knows what happened.
I wanted to ask something about your Siri experience. One of my favorite science fiction movies is a movie called Her,
Mm-hmm.
where a human being has a real emotional relationship with an algorithm. Um, you know, it's taken us a long time. From Siri to Her is how far, and how far are we along that curve to having algorithms that can give us the illusion of of real interaction?
I mean, I think Her is completely doable, except for the going to heaven part with the singularity, But I mean, the relationship part is doable completely, because the psychology and the social psychology of what that agent had is knowable, observable, learnable. Um, right now, are we on a path to that? Well, we're not currently seeing experiments where people are at scale yet, where people are trying to create AIs that have genuine love relationships with humans. I haven't seen them yet. I wouldn't be surprised if they're out there and by the dozens, and they just haven't perked up. Um, Once you get the flywheel of you get data from users that makes you more effective as an agent, which gets more users to you, and so on. Once you get that flywheel moving, there's no reason why you couldn't imagine lots of experiments of Her-like characters that will eventually lead to a sophistication like we saw in that movie.
So, since we're plunged into science fiction, and artificial intelligence is sort of leans toward that, there are a lot of people in Silicon Valley are trying out new kinds of interfaces, exploring new kinds of interfaces, brain-computer interfaces, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Elon Musk wants to drive a spike into your brain to do it. That seems a little bit, uncomfortable. Um, what about what are the consequences of something like that? The science fiction movie. Well, we all know about the Borg. Resistance is futile. You will be assimilated. What about keeping a bright line between what is human and what is the machine?
Well, I mean, actually, I'm on the board of a company that's doing EEG-based, brain sensing-based human augmentation to help people who can't speak. And so first of all, there's a ton of great positive value you can create with neurotech like this, and we should accelerate that research. Imagine being locked in, not being able to speak, and all of a sudden you can put some EEGs on the back of your head, and now you can speak. So these things are very positive and very powerful. I don't think there's a point in having a bright line there. I mean, again, we live in a society. We need to have a government and have conversations as a society, and we can say this stuff needs to be regulated. This doesn't. Here are the bright lines and how it's used. And the bright lines aren't technical bright lines; they're policy bright lines.
I think we've reached our limit. Thank you. Look forward to continuing our conversation.
Thank you very much. This was a great conversation.